Good morning, everyone. We might get started. Thank you very much for joining us today on our August instalment of Do I Pay the Ransom for the Cyber series run by RiskLogic. My name's Marcus Vaughan. I'm one of the directors at RiskLogic. Joined with me is Tim Archer, Head of Crisis Communications.
Good morning, Marcus.
And streaming in live from, looks like bright and sunny Melbourne there, Daniel Moko, who is our Head of Cyber Consulting. Good morning, Daniel.
Good morning, gentlemen. Welcome to the fourth instalment in our cyber series.
This one is going to be a very interesting one. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. We do have a big topic today, which is Do I Pay the Ransom? We're going to go through it as we usually do, run through some content and then give you an opportunity to talk through some Q&A as well. Really to start off, we're going to be focusing on what are those weak spots in anyone's cyber hygiene that can lead to an effective ransomware attack on your organization. Have a look at some best practice to get around that type of situation and mitigate against that situation. We're also going to look at some really fascinating case studies that are live, very current. They're happening as we speak, where organizations have been shut down by ransomware attacks, refused to pay, and also some that have decided to pay. On the back of that, we're going to have a fairly big and contentious discussion, no doubt, around do I pay the ransom? So we can get to some, I guess, key reflections on the pros and cons of doing so. As I mentioned, we're going to leave about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. It's a big topic today. If we do run over, we are recording this session, so you can always circle back and watch and relive your favorite moments in due course. To get started though, why don't we talk a little bit about avoiding this type of situation? So Daniel, I might lead with you. What do weak spots look like in anyone's cyber hygiene, and how do we avoid this in the first place?
Yeah, thanks Marcus, and once again, good morning, everyone. I think before we dive into some of the weak spots in cyber hygiene, I might just take a step back and touch really briefly on what is ransomware. So ransomware comes in many shapes and sizes, guys, but some variants are more harmful than others, but they all have one thing in common, which is asking for a ransom. So there's basically around 5 types of ransomware. You probably heard of some, you may not heard of others. So I'll just really quickly whip through those. So the first one is a crypto malware or crypto type of ransomware, and that's the one that was used in the WannaCry ransomware attacks back in 2017. There's another type called lockers, and this kind of ransomware, it locks you out at an operating system level. So it means you can't even get into your computer, let alone have a look at what files have been locked. Then there's scareware ransomware, which is not only great because it rhymes, but this is a fake piece of software that acts like an antivirus or a cleaning tool, and then you have to pay some money to get the scareware off your system. There's something called doxware as well. So doxware is all about the process of doxing. So doxing is taking a lot of your personal information and then releasing that online. So doxware sucks up or hoovers up all of the personal information on a system and then puts it online to for payment or for ransom. And then there's RAS, or ransomware as a service, and that's where you can buy or purchase an end-to-end ransomware service where someone will provide the software, the collection of money, the communication with the ransomware victim, and they take a percentage or a cut off the top. So that's a really quick tour, guys, of the ransomware that's out there. Like I said, the common thread in all of these pieces of malicious software is that you need to pay a ransom either to get back your data or to stop something from happening. And ransomware, like other pieces of malicious software, continues to evolve and grow as defenses and technology grows as well. But one of the really easy things, or one of the things I think that you can start doing right now, is have a look at your cyber hygiene, have a look at cyber awareness as a first line defense, as one of the layers of defense against ransomware. And look, one of the things is talking to people about phishing. So about 80 to 90% of phishing campaigns are successful and can result in a malicious software infection. This is an example on screen now of a certain type of spear phishing from a campaign that's active right now. It's active against the US energy sector. We believe it's being run from a group of Chinese government actors, and you can see there, this was a very tailored piece of phishing, spear phishing, that was directed at engineers with inside energy companies in the US. It's about a professional organization, and it's about them failing an exam, and all of this is being used to lure people in to clicking on that Word document there, to clicking on that attachment which contains the malicious software. So you can see phishing emails, they're getting much better. That one there, it's very tailored. It looks like a legitimate email. It's also an email people in this organization were probably expecting as well. So there's definitely an uptick in this spear phishing to enable the ransomware. I guess the other weak spot that we see time and time again in cyber hygiene that enables the proliferation of malicious software and ransomware is passwords. Now, passwords, guys, it's a bit of a bugbear of mine or anyone who's been in the information security game for a long time, because we get that it's a difficult thing for people to do and to get right. We have a lot of online services these days that require us to use a lot of passwords, but some of the common traps we see, passwords are weak. Yeah, people are still using password 123. No one in Risk Logic, and definitely no one on this call, definitely not the gentleman in Sydney. No, they're shaking their heads. Hopefully they're not using password one. Yeah, excellent. So I like to see. But there is still a lot of people using weak passwords, which makes it really easy for people to gain access to systems. People are reusing passwords as well. So they're reusing passwords across different services. And what might happen is there may be a compromise of passwords in one service, which then gives the crims or the hackers an easy way into another system or service that you're using because of a password reuse. And then people aren't employing other tools which give an added layer of security when it comes to credentials, which is what we call multi-factor authentication, or using multiple ways of attesting to who you are before you're granted access to a system. Look, guys, the other one when it comes to weak spots in cyber hygiene and cyber awareness is there's a fair degree of reluctance and reticence out there when people make a mistake. So far too many times we've created a culture within organizations that punish, which means when people make a mistake, they may open an email, they may click on a link, they're a bit embarrassed by it, and they think they may get in trouble, so they don't report or let IT teams know. So it's really important, if there has been an infection or even a suspected infection, if someone's clicked on a phishing email, is that is elevated to IT tech support or to the cybersecurity team as quickly as possible, so that we can keep quarantine measures off and we can start to isolate that machine from the network. But where there's a culture of reticence out there in an organization, that's not happening, and that's another weak spot, I guess, in cyber hygiene that can lead to a successful ransomware attack on an organization.
Which supports, I guess, the thought process, Daniel, that it's not really a tech issue, it's a people issue.
Absolutely, and a communication issue.
Precisely, and like I said, 80 to 90% of successful cyber attacks start with a phishing email.
Okay, so what do we do? How do we avoid this?
Yeah, great question, Marcus. And look, I think at the get-go, it's really important to note that you need multiple layers of defense here. So having one layer or having one really robust system or procedure or tool or policy in place won't be enough. Like I said, there's a lot of versions of ransomware out there. It's continually growing. Business is good if you're a cyber criminal and you're in the ransomware game. The risks are relatively low and the profits or the rewards are high. So you're seeing a lot of investment in new technologies, new ways to get ransomware on the system. So companies really need to adopt multiple layers of defense. What do some of those layers look like? I'll unpack some of those quickly for you now. We just spoke about it then, but really embedding good cyber hygiene in your business is important. And guys, this isn't a set and forget task. This is an ongoing task where you need to constantly engage people. The tricky thing when it comes to cyber hygiene or cyber awareness is you're often dealing with humans, adult humans, and you're trying to drive a behavior change, which is really difficult, and that requires constant reinforcement and constant effort. Look, the other thing is updating software and applying critical patches. This is a bit of the mechanics 101 of cybersecurity. It's really important. I mentioned earlier that there was the WannaCry ransomware that spread in 2017. That used an exploit called Eternal Blue. So that was an exploit in a Windows system that was originally developed by the NSA. Now, Microsoft actually had released patches for Eternal Blue that would have stopped WannaCry propagating, but people and companies hadn't applied that critical patch for any number of reasons. And what you saw was hundreds of thousands of systems being infected globally with the WannaCry ransomware. So updating software and applying critical patches, while it sounds like that grunt, boring work, is really important. Look, the other one, it may sound like common sense, but it's backup, 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 guys. It's really important, and I can't stress that enough. And not just from a cybersecurity perspective, but from a disaster recovery, a business continuity perspective, a robust backup strategy is really important, given the criticality and sensitivity of all the information assets that you own in your company at the moment. And look, the last thing is all these layers of defense are great, but things go wrong. We know that. Things in cybersecurity go wrong every day, every minute. So you need to have a response plan. And it's really important not just to have a robust response plan when it comes to events like ransomware, but you need to practice it. So everyone in your organization will have a role to play in that response plan. And people need to know what to do and how to do it when the pressure is on. And we're going to talk about, gentlemen, some examples later in this webinar where the pressure has certainly been on for some organizations and they've been found wanting.
Okay, so what does a good response look like, Daniel? I mean, we hit the
yeah, absolutely. So if the worst happens, Marcus, and you see that lock screen, and you'll probably gasp first of all. And so once that initial shock has set in, I think it's really important that you have considered what you need to do before, during, and after a ransomware incident. So that's about harking back to making sure you have an incident response plan in place and you've practiced that. Getting help quickly is really important. So it's really easy for your IT team, or if you have a cybersecurity team, to be overwhelmed really quickly. And the sooner you can get in professional help from outside, whether it be incident responders, network engineers, it's really important. The other thing, I guess, is make sure you've considered all of the options carefully beforehand. So before you see that lock screen, ensure that you've considered all of the legal and all of the regulatory requirements that come with a major ransomware attack or incident. And we've been discussing this since the very first webinar in this series, gentlemen, when we spoke about, you might recall CPS 234 and some of the requirements, the regulatory requirements now around reporting of cybersecurity incidents within that 72-hour window. So there's a lot of things that you need to make sure that you're prepared for when you see that locked screen. And I guess the last thing is, once again, I'm going to sound like I'm harping on this, but have a plan and stick to it, and have some really robust procedures in place. And guys, what you're seeing on screen there is quite a detailed roadmap that we have in our own cyber response plan. And as we help to work with clients about preparing them for a ransomware attack, that's what it looks like from our perspective, that we can help guide you through some of those early steps early on to make sure that you can consider everything that you need to when you have the unfortunate event of seeing that lock screen. And you can see that's one of the decision trees that we employ when a client has been affected by a ransomware attack. So there is absolutely a lot to see. So apart from the initial panic, which you're gonna feel when you see a lock screen, I think you need to immediately kick into that mode of, okay, what's next? Where's my plan? My plan will tell me what to do, and move forward from there.
Well, and hopefully you've got the culture, I guess, built in, Daniel, that someone who might be sitting very low in an operational state, who's clicked on the link and locked the screen, is actually going to report upwards pretty quickly to get the process started, right?
It's a great point, Marcus, and it harks back to one of the weak spots, which is that reticence. So if someone's clicked on the link and then they've just decided to, oh goodness, it's all too much, and powered down, and then they've let that piece of ransomware propagate on your network for hours, days, that's when you start to have some really serious problems. And that's when recovery becomes a real issue.
Okay. Recovery is a real issue. That's a very real thing happening as we speak. I think there's, the number of attacks we're hearing about in the media alone is just outstanding. Baltimore is one of those that is just mind-boggling for a whole raft of reasons.
Yeah, Daniel's going to talk us through the background on this, but before he does, I just have to say that I don't know why this Baltimore case study isn't getting more media coverage here in Australia. It's getting more covered overseas, but it's something that impacts all of us because of the ramifications. I'll pass it back to you, Daniel, but this should be reported on more regularly in Australia.
Yeah, completely agreed, Tim. I'm not sure why it's not getting more oxygen here, but City of Baltimore is a large city in Maryland in the US, a city of over 500,000 people, and they actually had a ransomware attack in 2018 that affected their 911 and what they call 311 phone numbers over in the US that, as you can imagine, when it comes to engagement with citizens, the 911 or the emergency services call is probably the most critical system that a city council or a local government can provide, and the ransomware attack took that down briefly. But what happened in May 2019 was a whole other kettle of fish for the city of Baltimore. So it had a number of its servers compromised by a new strain of ransomware called Robin Hood. You can take whatever sort of things from the name of that ransomware that you want to. But look, Robin Hood, and to the left of your screen, guys, you can actually see a copy of the ransom note there that was presented to the city of Baltimore. So this was a new strain of ransomware. It had actually affected another city in the US before Baltimore. It affected Greenville in North Carolina, but because of a number of reasons, Baltimore wasn't ready to stop the infection. So on about May 7th of this year, Baltimore's government computer systems went down entirely, and they were taken offline. So the ransom note demanded about 13 Bitcoin, which in current money, gentlemen, is about 76,000 US dollars. So whatever that equivalent in Australian dollars is these days, probably around 110,000 Australian dollars.
Depending on how the crypto market's going that day or that hour. Yeah.
Indeed. But like, I think the important thing to note here, and I haven't moved enough, so the apologies, the sensor light here has just gone off for a moment. There we go. I timed that perfectly, didn't I?
It hasn't been hacked in.
Exactly. But look, the ransom note was quite explicit that it stated if its demands weren't met within 4 days, not only would the price of the ransom increase, but within 10 days, the city would face a permanent loss of all of its data. So poor Baltimore hit twice in the space of about a year. But the attack had a real negative impact on a lot of city services. So the note there, you'll see systems are down until further notice, but it had a negative impact on things like the real estate market, as property transfers couldn't be completed until that system was restored. And you saw an inability of city workers to do basic tasks like communicate with each other and to communicate with citizens. So, you know, a really major attack. And I think, gentlemen, they're still suffering from the effects of this attack even now. What are we in early August?
Still going, still very much going.
Yeah, I mean, from a communications point of view, it was so crippling because it took out their email systems, their call centers, their customer service call centers, and look, they love their marketing terms, these hackers. That Robin Hood ransomware, it's a great marketing term, but it's pretty embarrassing when you've got the hacker actually going onto a public forum like Twitter and demonstrating to you directly that you're and tagging the mayor in that post that, yes, I'm real, because there was some reporting early on that this Robin Hood account was fake, but demonstrating, yep, I'm real, I've got your files, here they are, time to pay up. So from the very start, it's out there in the public right from the beginning, and it's in the public eye. It's not like there's this bat phone that you're taking the ransom call on, like in Hollywood. It's not behind closed doors. It's there for everyone to see. So from the very start, you've got to think about how you communicate to a hacker who's holding you to ransom. But let's have a look at the impact. So I think we've got their website here. You can see they put a big red box up on the front page of their website to say that we can't receive email, so please call us. Well, calling them, the regular customer call center was down, so they had to stand up alternative numbers. So obviously that leads to just bedlam in itself. They had to return to a lot of manual processes and workarounds, and created major inefficiencies. So just the communications piece was a major impact, not to talk about the fact that just online payment systems weren't working, you couldn't pay your water bill and so forth. So they set up alternative phone numbers. One of the steps that they took in order to communicate, and you forget about emails and how crucial they are for internal and external communication. It's like breathing. You don't realize how critical they are until you can't do it anymore. So one of the workarounds was some Gmail addresses. So they set up a bunch of Gmail addresses, but Google's anti-spam filters actually took them down because that's how Google stops bots and so forth setting up a whole bunch of Gmail accounts. So even in that situation, to their credit, Google very quickly turned around and made those Gmail addresses happen. But in a situation of pressure, just the time that it would have taken them to have that discussion with Google and say, hey, look, we really need this, it's just added pressure to an already pressurized environment. So it's a really big reminder to ask yourself the question, can we communicate when all our IT systems are down? And if the answer to that is, I'm not sure, or maybe, or no, then that's where a really close collaboration is required between ICT and the comms team to ensure that there's a plan in place that you can communicate when your IT systems are down.
Well, I think the additional thing that's really interesting here is watching how the hacker is almost, with that open forum via Twitter, is almost trying to turn the public who are being affected day in, day out, and increase the level of political pressure on the organisation to pay the ransom.
There was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of discussion in the media about it. The FBI came out and said, no, they shouldn't pay the ransom. Baltimore said, no, we're not paying the ransom, not only because, based on FBI advice, but also, well, it just goes against our values. And good on them for doing that. But what was the upshot? It's taken months for them to go down the alternative path, which is to rebuild their systems and get back up and running again. And I think after 1 month, they might have had about a third of their email systems back up in place. And 2 months later, they're still struggling, but getting there. And there's been probably a very conservative estimate that this has cost them about $18 million in recovery costs to get back to where they were versus a $76,000 US dollar ransom. So this comes to the big question that we're talking about today. Do I pay the ransom?
Well, and there's a very real business interruption effect there. I'm going to take a really quick poll. So we're going to put a scenario to you now. In this type of situation, if your systems have been locked down, let's take a scenario where your organization's had a ransomware attack. The systems have been locked for 30 days. The ransom's $100,000. Let's think that it's via Bitcoin, but we'll just call it 100,000 Aussie. At this point in time, 30 days in, do you advise your executive to pay the ransom? Yes, no. I'm going to give it a moment just to let some people run through. But this is, I mean, we need to take into account, this isn't just a possible event. This has now become very much a probable event.
Yeah, that's right. And we are seeing more and more case studies of organisations who are deciding to pay the ransom, and that is a very interesting situation that affects us all.
I think there was some stats put out just this week, gentlemen, a Telstra report, Telstra's survey of IT and business execs, and they surveyed about 320 Australian businesses, and 51% said they'd pay ransomware attackers to regain access to encrypted files.
Okay, I'm going to pull it up there. We're getting some really interesting results through. I'm going to share those results live. So at the moment, just on those that did respond, looks like we've got 28 responses there, 35% coming in on the yes, 73% thereabouts. I mean, there's clearly a decimal somewhere, but coming in as no, which is a really interesting take. Probably in line with where our I guess our general advice would sit, but thank you very much for that. Why don't we, sorry, Tim?
Well, we're just looking at a different case study in the States of organisations that did pay the ransom. So we've got Baltimore having come up with an $18 million bill to restore their systems, and then there's a bunch of local governments that have been targeted in these attacks. In Florida, they've no doubt seen what's happened in Baltimore and gone, well, we've got the choice of paying the ransom or paying $18 million plus, and they have paid it. So Riviera Beach paid $600,000, and then Lake City, another local government in Florida, paid 500,000. So there's $1.1 million just in 2 local governments in the States who have paid up. So Daniel was saying it's lucrative, it's working, it's big business. So yeah, this is happening more and more. So it leads us to the question of today, should we pay the ransom? Really interesting to see the results of that poll. And we've got some mixed opinions here, and that really does reflect the current commentary from experts, media, from business as well. So, I mean, let's look at the pros and cons, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And interesting that those figures were quite, I guess, slanting towards the no. So that's fascinating. And, this is the perennial question, I think, whenever I'm asked about ransomware is, so should I pay the ransomware? And I think, cybersecurity experts are much like economists in that if you get 3 of them in a room together, you'll probably get 6 opinions as well. But this is one of those really vexing issues. So, I mean, there are pros to paying a ransom, and the obvious pros are you may get your data back, and I will emphasize the may there. But I guess one of the cons is, say you do get your data back, are you sure about the integrity of that data? Are you sure that data still hasn't been exfiltrated? So there's a number of questions around, even if you do pay a ransom, the pros of getting the data back and being able to restore your services quickly. And I guess there's a lot of cons, gentlemen, that we'll touch on in a minute, but there's a lot of cons is you don't know who you're paying in this context. And I guess the other thing to consider is you're making a decision, you're making a business decision under duress. And that is never a good thing when you're running a business, or indeed in any other situation about making a decision when you're under duress. So there's a lot of conflicting advice out there at the moment. I know, Tim, you've got some advice from the New South Wales Police. I've seen the advice from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and their advice is quite strong in that they say never to pay. But Tim, what's some of the advice that you're hearing?
Yeah, certainly the same with New South Wales Police, just in our state here in Sydney. Their advice is predictable. It is a flat no, and that's totally understandable that they would say that. They really encourage you to call the police and involve them early, and that's a really important step as well. Probably in that flow chart, calling the police in early is a very good thing. And just on that conflicting advice too, I've just assessed the American media commentary, and we've got the Washington Post and Forbes posting really strong articles and opinion pieces about why you should never, ever pay the ransom. But other respected media outlets like ZDNet and Bloomberg running op-ed pieces about the fact that there's a time and a place for it, and it should be up to the individual business to make that business decision, and that sometimes it has merit. So really conflicting information out there, and that's why today's topic is so interesting.
Well, I mean, if you just think about the situation where, so Baltimore City Council were up to, it's at 61 days knocked out. You do the quantification on your business being knocked out for 61 days. Yeah. If you've got no access, I mean, they've been able to recover partial systems. That's a pretty big financial exposure. Yeah, that you're dealing with.
That's right, Mark. It's really easy for us to sit here and say, no, you should not pay the ransom, but it's not our business here that's at risk. It's not our profitability. It's not our customers that are at risk here. So whilst it's easy for us to say no, and there's people out there that are paying it based on pure business decisions, but I think what's really important is not just to base it on those economic decisions. It's not just the financials. You've got to think about the other things around it, like legality and insurance. Yeah, I mean, you've got some advice from insurance about what they're experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. I mean, the rate of losses and claims is increasing. That's a fact. That's the feedback that we're getting from the insurers. But there is coverage for this. Now, saying that, I mean, I think to your point, it's a bigger conversation than purely just looking at what's the financial impact, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to, well, you've got to ask yourself the question, what are you funding by paying this ransom? Are you funding a proliferation of additional ransomware attacks? Absolutely, no doubt about it. Are you funding or increasing the potential for you to be a repeat target? Absolutely, of course you are. But then think, are you possibly funding a smorgasbord of other nefarious activity like terrorism or organised crime or child pornography? Yeah, that's very likely. That's not a very easy question. Well, not a very easy question to ask yourself, but I guess what I'm saying is, if answering that question and making that decision to pay that ransom, if that makes you feel a little bit dirty and that you need a shower, well, what do your customers think about you? How does that make them think about you as a business, your leadership, I guess your moral compass? So that's going to have an impact on your goodwill, your reputation, and your brand. That's got a dollar cost to it as well. Very hard to quantify, but it's certainly, I guess, if you're going to be paying the ransom, you've got to be prepared for that information to become public and to be able to answer that question in public, whether it's media or shareholders or other stakeholders. Why did you do that? How did you justify it?
Completely agree, Tim. And there's a whole range of, once you've battled with those very real, I guess, ethical and moral questions, is also practical considerations. How do you pay? Do you have a stash of Bitcoin, just waiting for this type of event to happen? And if so, how do you execute the payments? There's a whole number of things.
Isn't it, Daniel? Bitcoin.
Indeed. So there's a whole number of things that I think, and on the balance of things, gentlemen, we come to the conclusion that our recommendation is not to pay. So there it's very strongly put as no, but I would put it in slightly easier terms about recommending not to pay, but always seek some expert help and consider, I guess, when you're seeking expert help, casting a net wide. So you may need to speak to lawyers, for example, or people with particular legal expertise in answering some of these questions.
Critical success factors.
Well, gents, we often come back to this one in the cyber series, but preparation really is the key here, because like I said at the beginning, there is so many strains of ransomware and other types of malicious software out there, is that the likelihood is at some stage in your business, you personally or your business will be impacted by one of these events. So you need to be ready, and being part of being ready is having that plan in place and making sure that plan isn't sitting in the back corner and collecting dust, but it is being able to be practiced and to be out there. And I guess we spent a bit of time up front this morning talking about focusing on your people and some of those common weak spots in cyber hygiene. So that's absolutely something that I think people need to focus on. And it's one of those low-hanging fruits, I guess, in the whole cybersecurity realm, but it's something that's often underbaked. So think about, are you giving your people the skills, knowledge, and the tools to get out there and engage confidently with the digital world? And look, guys, focus on backups. This is really important. That Telstra survey I mentioned earlier about people who would pay, the figure goes up to 79% of people said they would pay if there wasn't a backup in place. So that's a really neat way of mitigating a lot of the risks when it comes to ransomware, is having a backup. And once again, backups, they need to be tended to. They can't just, it's not a set and forget. You need to make sure that they're actually backing up everything in the required way, in the required time, and you can restore from backup. So that's really important. And I guess the final point here is about get help if you need it, and get that help quickly.
I think just one thing, to add on a couple of those points around preparation and obviously your backup point there, Daniel. The one thing that you can do in preparation to, and in particular if you're having an argument with exec around trying to get investment for more either cybersecurity or more additional backup or investment into that, the one thing you certainly can do is look at where this sits on your risk register. If I put my the chief risk officer hat on for a moment, I look at the probability of this occurring in the life cycle of our business. It's based on the data that's out there, it's highly probable now. So it's not just it's possible or may never occur. This is now a probable event that's going to happen, likely going to happen in due course of our business. And if you look at the exposure associated with that, again, if you quantify what does 30 or 60 days look like from a business interruption perspective, park data breach for 1 second, but an operational impact of not having access to all of your critical systems, which power your critical functions for your organization, the impact is going to be high, very high, or potentially catastrophic. So if you're in a position where you're struggling to get that investment for additional cybersecurity, I mean, I would be looking at what does that inherent risk factor look like? How does that compare to our organization's risk tolerance on any given day, week, or month? And then what are the risk controls that we need to invest in? And what are those costs for risk controls that we know will have a material impact on mitigating that risk down to an acceptable level of residual risk?
Yeah, I also think running it through that formal risk process as well gives you that ability to do a whole of business assessment on this scenario. If this happens, what's our whole of business response? Not just the financial cost and the IT response, especially around the communications piece, the reputation, the goodwill, the brand damage. So taking a really mature whole business approach to it, and that's where an exercise based around a ransomware attack can really flush out that conversation. If you're having trouble having that conversation within your organization or getting traction on it, then an exercise around this scenario will really help that.
You typically see a lot of oxygen leave the room when you run a ransomware scenario exercise. It's a real the light bulbs go on.
Yep,
when organisations feel how clunky or unprepared that response looks like.
For sure.
Daniel, any final points before we move on to Q&A from yourself?
No, gentlemen, I think you've covered them all off very nicely, very, very precisely. And I think once again we've ended on exercising, and I can't reiterate just how important that is. I do a lot of exercising of a lot of teams and a lot of clients, and consistently when you see those light bulb moments, then you absolutely see the value in all the other work that we've just spoken about.
Yeah. Excellent. This is my favorite part, taking curly questions from the audience. We have run over a little bit. We're going to try and get through as many of these as possible. As I mentioned before, we are recording, so we'll try and get through as many as possible. If we don't get to anything online, we'll come back to you individually offline. To ask a question, wave the mouse around on the screen. A little panel will pop up. You'll see Q&A down there, likely at the bottom. Please type in your question, and we'll kick off now. Okay, if you're 30 days out of action, what options do you have? Want to look at that from a technical point of view?
Well, look, and hello, Noel, thank you for your question. Look, if you're 30 days out of action and your options are narrowing significantly, aren't they? I mean, by then you've probably suffered some really critical business impacts, and you've probably reached a point where you may have to pay to get some of your data back, particularly in the absence of backups or working restoration. So either that or you have to start anew. So your options are limited, and the more time it takes you to restore, and the more time you're behind the eight ball, your options are limited. And I guess, Tim, from a comms perspective, if you're 30 days out of action, you probably lost all of your ability to control that narrative or to get ahead of that narrative.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. I always say crisis communications is a sprint, not a marathon. So those first couple of days will really determine that narrative. So, yeah, but if you're still going after 30 days, then you still haven't sorted it out, well, then you probably weren't prepared in the first place.
Agreed.
Another question here: are the police experts in this? Probably based on the advice that they're providing earlier in our slides. Daniel, comment?
Well, yeah, as a former Australian Federal Police employee, I'd say yes, they are. Some of them are absolutely, Noel, and they have a very deliberate stance, and I'm sympathetic to the stance as well. But the police probably are not experts in your situation or in the context of an event that's happening to you. That's why it's so critical to get that expert advice early on. But yet some of them are absolutely experts, and I think their advice comes from a good place.
And look, I'll add to that, having worked in communications at New South Wales Police as well. They've got a dedicated cybercrime unit, and they do a good job. The chances of prosecution, especially when a hacker might be sitting in a lounge room in Romania or something in his tracksuit pants, well, who knows? But if police don't know, then they definitely can't do anything about it. If they can't prosecute, well, that's very tough. But if they can build a picture of what's happening with the most up-to-date information and data from victims, then they can take a much more strategic approach at solving these crimes and helping prevention as well.
That's very good. What if your backup data is also corrupted?
Oh man, that's a world of hurt, and that's something I guess you need to consider in your plan. And a robust plan will have some options for you to consider. But I guess that's when the value of the expert advice and opinions come in, and it's a really tough cookie. And I think that was another question from Noel. It's something that I guess you need to consider as part of your plan, and something that you need to be prepared to start afresh or to start a new one.
Yeah, makes sense. How do you think ransomware is going to evolve?
Great question, and I can definitely see, like I said, this is something that's a good return when it comes to a cyber crime. So you can see it continuing to evolve, and it will evolve. I think we'll see a lot more cases of it happening to us in our personal lives, so in our personal information presence, so at home. And I think we'll also see it manifest in the pricing will change as well. So the economics of ransomware are really fascinating to dissect. We could probably spend another hour on that another time, gentlemen. But I think what you'll start to see is smaller payments for really critical files that we need in either a business or a personal context, and that will be priced at just the right amount to say, you know what, rather than go through all the effort of a backup restore or whatever, I'm just going to pay this amount and be done with it. And you'll start to see, I guess, the ability for cyber crims to in some way flat their credentials, that if you do pay us, you're going to get your data back.
Look, yeah, to add to that, Daniel, too, it's a market that's maturing. Obviously, you can sell anything as long as the market's willing to pay, and obviously we're seeing more of that happening. But in the States, even there's even organisations that their bread and butter is to do that negotiation with hackers to retrieve your data. That's incredible that there's actually even a market for that. There's legitimate businesses saying that they can help you out. So whether they can or not is another question.
Well, that's weakness in cyber hygiene fueling the industry, isn't it? And creating an industry.
It has created an industry. There's no doubt about that.
Unfortunately, business is booming. It seems that application whitelisting and decent email filtering will prevent most ransomware. Why do you think most organisations still aren't implementing application whitelisting? Daniel, you have a take on that?
Yeah, g'day, Dean. Thanks for your question. Thanks for joining us today, mate. Good to hear from you. Look, I think it's one of those things that we've all known we should be doing it for a long time, but for some organisations, it's just put in the too hard basket, or it's put in the basket of I'll get to it eventually before I implement something else that might seem a little bit easier to do. So you're right in that you could negate a lot of the attacks if you did have a robust application whitelisting and also a decent email filtering system to stop those phishing emails before they get in. But I honestly think it's in the too hard basket. And it's application whitelisting isn't a new tactic. It's been around, and it's been in the ASD's top 8 mitigation strategies for years now. But I just think it's one of those things that people put in the too hard basket and put in the basket for another day.
Which you could say across a lot of cyber security applications, but strategies, Daniel.
Yeah, indeed. And I can see Dean's just responded that it's not implemented in his organisation yet, but soon. So yeah. Thank you.
And again, that's where an exercise might focus attention on the need for it if you're having trouble getting it up.
Indeed.
Is there a code amongst criminals to trend that criminals will release the data after payment?
Yeah, I think there is honor among thieves, I think is the saying for some of these people. And I think you do see a mixed bag. And look, the statistics that are out there, they widely vary. So some people, it ranges from 50% of people say they get their data back in the state that it was, right up to 80. But there is still a significant amount of people who are paying and they're not receiving anything, because if you're targeted by a specific cybercrime gang, this may be their business model, is that once you pay, forget it, they'll just move on and junk the data or whatnot. So it's a mixed bag there, Phil, and it will depend entirely on the context. And I know that in some ransom notes that I've seen, some of the crims are providing bona fides or reviews of their ability to get the data back once you've paid.
This is probably one I'll field. How do you see the cyber insurance market respond to the scenario due to their exposure? I think it's always circumstantial based on, I guess, the exposure that the underwriter is willing to accept, and that comes down to a lot about what's actually in your policy from a wording perspective, and also from a limits perspective, in terms of what they will and won't pick up. I can say from discussions with insurance brokers and insurers themselves that there is a definite increase in terms of claims from a ransomware perspective. So that is increasing at a rate of knots, which is not a great thing. The longer term impact that will eventually have on the insurance industry is that premiums will eventually, you would expect, due to the loss ratio increase. However, I think there's also, again, in discussions with insurers and brokers that are out there, that there are, I guess, a mixed breed of underwriters as well. Some that have been around the block a number of times and really understand their risk exposure, and some that might be opportunistic from a pricing perspective. So I think probably the best course of action there is to get a really good understanding from your broker around what's actually in your cyber insurance policy and what's not. What limits and sub-limits apply due to a whole range of situations. And again, I would look at your risk register around what's important to you from a risk exposure perspective. I'd have a good think about quantifying what that business interruption impact looks like, because that's where we're seeing the bigger losses come from organisations. And then I'd be looking to match that against, I guess, your insurance limits and what your organisation can afford. But overarching, if you haven't considered cyber insurance, again, I would just pose that question. If you've got two options, paying a ransom versus investing that money into a cyber insurance policy or a cyber security risk mitigant strategy, preparation as opposed to being stuck in a situation where you're investing into a ransom is always going to be better.
And Marcus, I might just add, supplement to your point, that a lot of the good insurers will allow you rapid access to that expert help that we spoke about. So if you have an insurance policy and the worst does happen, the criticality of getting that expert help onboarded quickly is made much easier if you can contact your insurers who may have some help at hand really quickly.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We're pretty much out of time. I do have just one question here, which we'll take offline, but do you have a list of resources, phone numbers we can include in our critical incident plan for a ransom event? That's going to be obviously tailored to you, but just really quickly, people you should be reaching out to. I might do a quick roundtable. Tim, who would be on your list?
Well, from a communications point of view, getting that external help is critical, because in a situation like this, that the workload on your existing comms team just goes through the roof, especially if they've taken out your ability to communicate. So getting external help. And look, one thing I would add to, a little bit off topic, but when I spoke to New South Wales Police, they also mentioned a service called, or a website called nomoreransom.org. So I think that's just worth looking at. I don't know a lot about it, but they tell me that it's a collective or collaboration of international law enforcement agencies as well as software security organisations that can potentially, you upload some of the data, and they check to see if there's existing keys that are out there that can unlock your data before you actually have to open.
Yeah, it's a really good resource, Tim. It's driven out of Europol and some of the European police forces, and it really is a first-stop shop if you've suffered a ransomware event.
Right, Daniel, who's on your list in terms of first points of contact?
Oh, look, you've got to speak to an expert or a cyber incident response expert. So if you don't have one on hand, make sure you think seriously as part of your overall strategy about having a plan in place, and that person, that organisation will be able to help guide you through all the steps that you need to consider. So have that incident responder ready to go. The
one thing I'll just add to that is also being able to access your cyber incident response plan. So have a think about an air gap digital solution or a hard copy, obviously, around being able to access it, because it is one thing that we run into. And the sign on the door in the Baltimore case is a great example. When your systems are down, accessing stuff on your systems is not as easy as what you think. So just making sure that you've got access to your cyber incident response plan, or looking at a tool like CQ Command that sits on a totally different server altogether, can put you a long way ahead in being totally blindsided on the day.
Yeah,